They think I don't really have a special voice, but they do. And I one of my favorite things to say to my clients is, I want you to think about how you walk around all day talking to the animals that live in your house. I guarantee you have different voices for your animals. I bet you have different voices for different plants. I bet the way that you might talk to your mom or your grandmother is different from the way you talk to your best friend or your partner. Like, we have different voices. It doesn't mean we're being inauthentic.
Hey, Jen, so good to have you on the podcast today. So to introduce yourself to my audience, can you tell everyone a little bit about who you are and who you help?
Yeah. You know what I figured out? I work with those experts who have been in their field for a long time, at least 3, 5, 7 years. And they're at that point where they're like, I know what I do. I'm really good at what I do, but I don't know how to talk. Like, I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to make it come out of my mouth. So their first question is, how do I say what I do so that other people get it? And how do I say it so it sounds like me? So in like fancy marketing terms, I'm a brand voice and messaging person. But what I really do is basically help people know how to talk about what they do and how to say it so they don't sound like a robot, or they don't sound like, their former version of themselves when they worked in industry, or they don't sound like anybody else in their industry because they feel like it might sound like their mentor or their old coach or a competitor or something. So it's like, how do you talk about what you do and sound like yourself and let it like roll out of your mouth, like it's normal.
Yeah, 100%. And I think this is something that's so overlooked by so many business owners because, and we were just talking about it before we jumped on this recording, is that, sometimes you don't know how to talk about yourself because you're so in the weeds of your own business and you're just like, I am who I am and I do what I do, right? And it's hard to express that in a way that can connect with your audience in the way that you might envision your business connecting with them. And so that's why it's so important what you do and why it's so important to have a brand messaging guide in general. Do you kind of agree?
Yeah. Well, what you said was interesting. You said when you had this done a few years ago, the person working with you helped you see aspects of yourself, nuances of yourself that like you don't see because you're just living with it. It's like breathing to you. You are Melissa. Melissa is, walking around with Melissa all day long. So you don't see all the little nuances that somebody outside of you can see. So yes, it's vital, especially in the days of AI where everybody wants to plug something in and have it spit something back out, but a lot of shit starts to sound generic. And so yes, it is important to have somebody outside of yourself do it for you. In fact, today I was just telling you, I got off a call with a new client who we're doing her brand voice and messaging guide. And at the end of her brand voice finder, it was like she kind of had wings on her back and she was flying around because she was like, oh my God, I've been doing this for so long, but I've never been able to like grab and explain how I do what I do. And by having somebody outside of you do it for you, then it becomes easier to like talk about what you do and put your content out there and make your marketing feel like you, but also have it meet your audience's needs. And those are two things that you have to do together. It's like, it has to sound like you, but it also has to resonate with your audience. And it's like a complex, nuanced thing to do. It's really hard to do yourself.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love that you brought up AI because it's such a big topic right now is, how can we use AI to make, our content creation faster or to help us come up with marketing terms or whatever it may be. Yeah. But with that comes that everyone's going to start to sound the same.
I know.
And so how can, right? And like, you can tell when someone's using AI for the most part, right? So how can we blend our personalities and our brand voice, if you will, which basically should be your personality at the end of the day. How can we blend those together to really actually attract your ideal client? And so kind of spinning off of that, like what are the biggest mistakes that you see people making right now when it comes to creating a brand voice?
I want to start by saying people are listening to this and they're like, oh, okay, I have to weave my personality in, which is something that they've heard a lot, right? But here's another wrench in the works. What if you're a person who's like, I'm intensely private. I don't like to be in the spotlight. I don't enjoy being the center of attention. And so that adds a whole other layer because those people are thinking like, oh my God, how am I supposed to weave my personality in when I don't really want it to be about me? I want to be an expert. I want to show up and serve. I want to be known, but I don't want to be famous. And so when we add that layer on, which I think is actually more people than it's not, right? So for people who are like, here I am, look at me, I'm so amazing, like they don't really struggle with brand voice and messaging. Like they've kind of like nailed down, this is my personality and I'm bringing it to play. But for the rest of us, it's like, how do we parse out the parts of ourselves? First of all, how do we see them, and how do we like decide what our brand voice and persona is? Because even if you don't want to be famous, which I personally don't, I don't enjoy being in the spotlight of my marketing, which kind of doesn't make sense because I'm an extroverted person. I used to be a teacher. I used to be a professor. Like I'm used to standing up in front of people. I love teaching, but like in my marketing, I don't want to make it about me. So how do I bring in my brand voice and create messaging that resonates with my audience without making it about me? So that's like the nuance that I kind of wanted to add to our chat today.
Yeah. And I love that you said this, because I think when people say, put your personality in something, you're right, it's so vague. And there's so many layers to that, depending on who you are as a person, right? You said you're an extrovert, but you don't necessarily want to make you your personality, like your brand, your personality necessarily, or put yourself out there. Whereas like I would identify myself as more of an introvert, actually, but I don't mind that parts of myself are online, and I don't have a problem being vulnerable in some areas. But my personal life, I like to keep my personal life. I don't like sharing about my friends and family. I don't like sharing about those things, right? And so there's so many levels depending on who you are. It's not a one size fits all situation.
Yes.
And so I think you really need to figure out, what do you feel comfortable sharing? Are you okay with your kids being online and part of your brand? Are you not? There's no right or wrong answer, but just understanding that when people say, put your personality in your brand voice, it's not a one size fits all and let's put everyone in a box kind of thing.
Yeah. So I'm actually, since this is where we landed today, I think it's really going to be fun to have this chat that I haven't had in so many places. I've taught it in a couple of private communities, but I kind of haven't rolled it out and been talking about it on podcasts or shows. So I think if you can just kind of wing it with me, I'm excited to share how people can step into their brand voice and their brand persona without feeling like completely overexposed, and with messaging that feels like they're always on display. So if you're ready to jump in, we could do that.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so honored that my audience gets to be the first people to hear this. This is amazing.
I just threw a wrench in the whole works today.
That's okay. I love it. That's how we roll.
Okay. Well, I think that you asked me what are the mistakes that people make when it comes to, sharing marketing in a brand voice that feels good to them. So number one, I think one of the things you need to acknowledge, whether you're an introvert or you don't want to be on center stage or you don't like the spotlight, like it's important to acknowledge that the way you say things is different than how other people would say things. And I know that probably sounds trite at this point, but because we're always walking around, breathing our own air, thinking our own thoughts, talking to ourselves all the time, we kind of basically take it for granted that we have an interesting approach that maybe other people don't have, or words that we use that other people wouldn't use. So the very first thing I think is people make the mistake that nobody wants to hear from me anyway. It doesn't matter if I even show up. I don't really want to say that I have a brand, a personal brand or a brand persona. And I hate to be the one to break it to you, but if you have a business where you're the service provider and it's your face, you have a personal brand, and you don't have to be like you don't have to think of yourself as like a Kardashian, but you just are a human being who is a service provider who is showing up as yourself. And that's the first mistake I think people make, is not acknowledging your freaking personal brand.
Yeah, 1,000%. And I love what you said is that, even if you are a brand, like a brand name and not your personal name, you still are a personal brand. And when it comes down to marketing 101 is really that people attract people like them. So if you're not showing who you are as a person, are you going to be even attracting the right clientele for your brand? Right? Like if we come really down to your ideal client, and that's why it's so important to have this stuff nailed down, because it trickles into the rest of your marketing.
Yeah. I mean, especially I'm going to say as we're going into 2025, especially as like the robots are ruling the world, trust is it. Like people have to trust you. So Okay, we can acknowledge that you are a human who has a brand, you're a personal brand. What nuances of yourself do you want to bring forward? So that leads me to my next thing. To build trust, it doesn't mean you have to bring people into the dermatologist's office with you. It doesn't mean you need to kind of bleed all over the internet in the name of being vulnerable. And I've talked to a lot of people and they feel like at this point, it's kind of been bashed over their head. Like, you need to be vulnerable. You need to be authentic. You need to be relatable. And I believe some of that is true, but there has to be a point where you get to say yes to this, no to that. And again, only you can make those decisions for yourself. But your audience doesn't need to know every single thing about you to trust you. They don't need to be always brought everywhere you go. You don't need to let them know everything you're doing. And like you said, are your kids off limits? Is your family off limits? What's off limits? So the second thing I would say is people have a mistaken belief that to get people to trust you, you have to bare your soul, and you don't. I would say those are the top two things. And then the third thing, especially when it comes to your voice and your brand persona, I feel like people can have more fun with this than they think. They think I don't really have a special voice, but they do. And one of my favorite things to say to my clients is, I want you to think about how you walk around all day talking to the animals that live in your house. I guarantee you have different voices for your animals. I bet you have different voices for different plants. I bet the way that you might talk to your mom or your grandmother is different from the way you talk to your best friend or your partner. We have different voices. It doesn't mean we're being inauthentic or we're being bullshitty, right? So my question is, how do you want to show up to talk to your audience, where you can stay in your main register? You're not up here being fake and phony, right? We're just keeping it right here. Yeah. And that you really actually already do have several voices. And so we just have to harness what your brand voice is. And we can talk about how to do that. And I'm happy to dive into that. But I think those are the top 3 mistakes that people make.
Yeah, I love it.
How do those land with you? Because you're an expert in this stuff too.
Yeah, I think that's right on the money. And I hear this, because I specialize in YouTube and video, I hear this so much about authenticity and how do I feel comfortable on camera? Because when people put themselves on camera, especially on YouTube, or if they're creating, YouTube shorts or TikToks or whatever it may be, anything video related, there is a level of vulnerability of just being on camera itself, right? And so that's why I always love to do this core work first, is what is your brand voice? What do you feel comfortable sharing? How can we infuse your personality into your niche? How can we make you feel more comfortable on camera? Because that's really what's going to set you apart. And I think, like you said, moving into 2025, YouTube has become a land of, how-to videos, which still serve their purpose on YouTube. But how can we make you stand out from every other ex-guru out on YouTube, right? Yeah. If you search how to scrub your toilets, I don't know, first thing that came to my mind, there's probably, a million different videos out there. But if you're a cleaning expert, if that's your brand, infuse your personality into that and make your personal brand more than just how to clean a toilet.
Yeah.
But she cleans it because she does it in this fun way, or she's got a fun personality, or those kinds of things make you the person that someone wants to work with. And so I think moving into 2025, this is such an important episode for my audience to listen to, because I want them all to become not just the next guru on YouTube, but really that go-to authority that people choose over everyone else because of their brand voice, if you will, or their personality, or that shoulder-to-shoulder leadership that they're showing on their channels. Yeah.
Well, so what I'm about to explain came to be from a client who we were just chit-chatting. She was a person on my list for a long time. And she sent me an email. She replied back to one of my emails and she was like, I love all the things you're talking about that have to do with brand voice, but I don't know how to do it because she's a mom with an 18-month-old child. She's also a doctor of psychiatry, although she doesn't do that work anymore. She's got this doctor of psychiatry at like, her degree and her expertise. And then she's got her business. And then even within the business, she's a coach and she's a business person, right? So we have all of these parts of ourselves. And what she was saying in her email to me is like, I feel like they all kind of get conflated. And sometimes I feel like I show up like my mom version of myself. And sometimes I show up like my doctor version of myself. With who I want to show up as is my coach business person of myself. So I started to think about this. And I was like, let's parse out your personas. So for anybody listening or watching, really, I want you to think about, like, if you're a table person, like you've got 3 columns. If you're like a visual person, maybe you've got 3 circles, and maybe they're like Venn diagrams, or maybe you've got 2, or maybe you've got 4. But I want you to think about the different parts of you as a whole. And how would you parse them out? So for this client, it was doctor, coach, business owner, mom. Those were like kind of the big buckets in her life. And I just had her start thinking about what all of those different versions of her how they would show up, how her voice would be, what the kinds of things she would say as each of those personas. So I had that was just like a little thing that I had done with her. And then I was like, this is a thing. People need to understand that they can parse out the different parts of themselves, and that your audience does not need or even deserve all the parts of you. Like, we get to hold back, because the more I talked to, especially women who don't want to be in the spotlight, who are experts in their field, what they kept saying to me was, I just always feel so overexposed. So how can we parse out our personas so we're not overexposed? So then I kind of turned it into like a little mini workshop with this group I work with. And I was like, I want you to think about the things that you say that you're an expert, around the topic that you're an expert in. So in one of the groups, one of the women I was working with is a coach for Latina moms who are kind of breaking the cycle of what their moms did when they were growing up. And they want to break the cycle of like the yelling and hitting and like all of the stuff that they grew up with that was normalized. So we just started playing around with like, how do you break up? Like, so she's a therapist, like, so she's got her PhD, psychologist. She's a coach now, but she's also a mom. And so I was just like, parse yourself out into those 3 places. How would your therapist self talk about this problem? And she started talking about like nervous system regulation and breaking generational cycles. And it was all of that jargon that, for a brand voice that's trying to be a coach, trying to be a relatable coach, trying to gain trust, like using those words does not resonate with your audience. So the messaging would be off. So you can start to see how these things are intertwined, right? Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, well, if you were a mom, and you were just talking to your best friend, what might you say? And she's like, oh, I would like kind of talk in Spanish and use Spanish words about how, like my mom used to hit me with her flip-flop. And like, she kind of made it really funny. And I said, as a coach, what would you say? And she had a completely different approach, like basically saying, you don't have to parent the way your mom mommed. You get to, change everything. You don't have to do it the same way. And it was just a much more relatable thing. And when we parsed out these 3 personas, she was like, okay, I can see, she could basically list all the things she would say as a therapist and then put them aside and never have to go talk about that again in her marketing, because that's not how she needs to talk to her coaching clients. And then she was looking at everything she said, like how she would talk as a mom, maybe to her best friend or her sister. And she could pluck out a couple of things that were funny and still relatable, but not so private that she would feel like she was giving away all the family secrets, and move them into her bucket of like coach/marketing her coaching business, right? So this little tiny thing I was just starting to talk about it with people. And I'm hoping that anybody listening can start to see like, oh, there are different parts of myself. And no matter where I am, I'm talking in a different way. I'm feeling different things. I'm acting differently. And like, how do we want to show up as that person or that persona who's marketing our business, not how we were in industry, not how we are at home. And so that was just this little thing I started to do. And I'm just watching people kind of like go, like their brains are exploding as they start to see like, it's safe for me to not have to lean back on my old industry jargon or my old industry self, but it's also safe for me to protect who I am when I'm trying to find my brand persona. And I will say this little exercise, it seems really simple, but I think it's powerful. But I also think you need to kind of spend some time with it and go back to it. And then when you get your little buckets or your circles or your columns filled out with what you would say, I think it's important to have it be available to you as you're creating content until it kind of becomes not normalized to you, but like second nature to you. Like, oh, this is the persona I'm writing in. Oh, here I'm dipping too much into my mom self. Here I'm dipping too much into my private self, or here I'm dipping too much into my doctor self. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I love this exercise.
Oh, good.
I love it. It's so simple.
Yes.
And as you were explaining it, I was sitting here nodding like, oh, yes. Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I have never thought about brand voice or messaging like this before, because you are completely right. We talk.
You're like making me so happy. I was so worried this would be so simple to talk about. I'm like, is this too simple?
Simplicity always works, right? It always works because we always make things way too complicated in our heads. And I love this exercise because it works for all parts of your marketing. Because now that you have these 3 buckets of, or however many buckets you have, like you said, you sit down to write an email and you can be like, okay, I'm going to put on, how I would talk to my best friend, or I'm going to put on this persona to then talk about this. I love it. It's so simple. And my one kind of follow-up question about the exercise is, do you think that we can dip into multiple buckets depending on what we're doing?
Well, this is really interesting. So this one client who I was telling you about with the Latina moms, she realized the way she talks to her best friend and her sister is way more fun for her to talk about. And so she actually did the exercise, and then she realized she could pull all of these things into that middle bucket of coach, and that they could live in kind of 2 places. However, another client did this work, and what she found is in her personal life, in her personal bucket, she was like, I'm very introverted. I'm very quiet. I'm not very outgoing. I tend to be more reserved. But when she did her bucket for her business, like how she wanted to show up as a coach, she was so much more playful and fun. She realized that she needs to bring more, she wanted, not needs to, but wanted to bring more of that into her personal interactions. But she's been so protective in her personal interactions, but she felt more safe being open in her brand persona. So yes, once you see how it's all parsed out, you can then pull things in as they suit you. And then you have the freedom at any time to put them back in another bucket where you don't have to bring them in if you don't want to.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
I love it
because you're really kind of talking about human psychology at some sort of level here also, right? Of what kind of identities do we put on ourselves for different areas of our lives? And I think especially as women, this is something that, we try to break sometimes, of having to be that safe, perfect woman that, if you were raised like I was raised in the time period I was as a millennial, we were very much raised to be the good girl, be quiet, do what you're told, don't be too loud, don't be all these things. And so sometimes we get in our own heads about that, either in our personal life or our business life. But then when we're with our best friends, we can be loose because we feel safe. Or we feel vulnerable, or whatever that may be. And so by identifying these buckets, we can start to see where those identities might be placed on ourselves and how we can start to break them and
if we want to
mix and match if we want to. Yeah, 100%. Yes. But it's a really simple exercise that I think is actually going a lot deeper than we might realize by identifying just those different places, and then start to play around with, okay, maybe I want to be more playful in my business and I'm more playful in this other area of my life. How could I integrate that in a way that feels safe and good for me?
Yeah. And the other thing, I want to remind people that if you try it and it doesn't work, that's okay. It's not like you need to scrub it from the internet, take it off you. You don't have to remove it. It's just a blip on the radar screen. So there is a bit of experimentation here. And, as an example, when my son was young, I would show his pictures and like talk about him. But now that he's a senior in high school, things are different and there's different rules for him, And so it's just like I've kind of pulled back on that part of my brand persona. So we get to, tweak, reassess, reinvent our brand personas anytime we want to.
Yes, this is such a good reminder. I always say to my coaching clients all the time that you're the CEO. You get to put your CEO hat on, which means that nothing in your business is written in stone, right? This isn't corporate where everyone tells you what to do. But you get to make the decisions. And that's
but that can be harder sometimes too.
It can be.
You're the boss.
100%. Yeah. Pros and cons to everything, right? But yeah, play around and like, don't be afraid that like, if I make this my brand persona, this has to be now my brand voice for the next 5 years. It can be your brand voice for the next week. It can be your brand voice for the next day. If you put something up on social media and you decide, I didn't like that didn't feel good to me, cool. Change it the next day. Like, nothing is written in stone. And so I think that's such an important thing to remind everyone of, because sometimes that like fear of the unknown or fear of it being permanent keeps us from taking action, because we're like, oh, well, once it's out there, it's now this permanent thing, but it's not.
I think we're also afraid of our audience calling us out on it. Like, oh no, will I disappoint people if I stop doing this? Or will people notice and then call me out on it? And maybe, yes. But like, you don't owe people an explanation. I've just decided to take my brand in another way. Or, for an example, when I first started doing my own brand voice assessment and trying to figure out what my brand voice is, I realized I had what's basically called like an underdog type of voice. And this comes from years of being a high school teacher, a college professor, and a yoga teacher. And in those venues, my whole approach is like, hey, let me meet you where you are. Does this feel good today? Did you bring a pencil? Did you do the read? It's all very like gentle and hesitant and mites and it's okay. And I realized in my online persona, it was killing my business because I always sounded like I was hedging. And it made me sound not as confident as I actually am. So I was like, okay, how do I move out of this underdog voice and brand persona and move into something that sounds more confident? I mean, I'm a 54-year-old person who has 2 master's degrees. I've been doing this a long time. Like, I am confident, but my language in real life is much more, I would say probably more gentle, right? I'm not telling people what to do. My brand persona is, I've been doing this for a long time. I am confident that I can help you, but also I'm going to wave the yellow flag for you because we need to slow down and assess what's right for you. And so just that little tweak between being like, I don't know, maybe let's see, versus hold on, I can help you, let's slow down and assess it, like made the world of difference. And I started to see people on my email list responding to me completely differently and saying things like, wow, you sound so much more confident, or, oh my God, I love the tack that you're taking on this, or like whatever they were responding. And they weren't necessarily saying like, you sucked before, but what they're saying is, you sound so much more confident and accomplished now. And so, yes, your people might come to you and say something for you, but like you have, again, complete freedom as the brand owner to say yes. And it was a conscious decision, for my reasons, and I don't have to explain it to you. And if they're disappointed, like they're allowed to be disappointed. If they're sad that you're not bringing them everywhere, like on your stories that you used to bring them, then like, that's okay. Like they're allowed to be disappointed. There's plenty of other creators out there who will bring them into them shaving their legs today or whatever it's going to be. So
100%. I was just going to say that. I'm like, there is someone out there for everyone. So if, I'm not your cup of tea, that's totally okay. That's completely fine. You can find someone else. But I really liked that you just shared that about your personal story, because as entrepreneurs, it's like the greatest personal development journey you'll ever be on. I always say.
So
and so, who you are when you first start your business, or who you were 6 months ago, or maybe who you are today is going to be different than who you are in 6 months. So your brand voice or who you're showing up on online will change. will evolve, and that's okay. Right? It has to. Exactly. Like when I think back when I first started on YouTube, I was like so concerned that I wasn't going to show up as this expert that everyone needed me to be, right? And I still battle with this, to be totally honest with you. And you know, it's like, oh, well, if I'm going to show up as a YouTube expert, I better know absolutely everything when it comes to this. Maybe you're listening to this and feeling the same way about your niche. And that's why I wanted to share this story, is that, you know, we sometimes put our guru hat on or our expert hat on thinking we need to be perfect or we need to show up and know and have all the answers. That's not necessarily how entrepreneurship works or owning a business works. Like, you're not going to know everything all the time. And so allow your brand voice to kind of follow in that direction. Like, can you, instead of having to know everything, can you just share with your audience what you know right now, or the journey you're taking to learn that thing? And I think that's a big lesson I learned.
Some people's brand voice actually is learning as you go. It is, hey, I'm on this interesting journey. Follow along with me. I don't know all the answers. Like, for some people, that's a very active choice that they make. So if that's part of your personality and that's part of your brand, like, don't be afraid to lean into that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's no right or wrong, or like feeling like you have to be some sort of way to be successful. It's not like that at all.
Yeah. I think people listening to you, like, we're on YouTube. You're the YouTube expert. That's your business. How could you possibly know everything? And honestly, if we waited until we knew everything, we would never get started.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. It's so true. Yeah. So just give yourself some grace, have fun, do this exercise. Anyone listening that Jen just laid out for us beautifully, because I think it's such a powerful one, and really dig deep into like, what are the different categories of my life or my personality, and like, how can you play around with that to show up more authentically, if you will, that buzzword online. Do you have any like final big tips? Like, I know there's so many words when it comes to creating your brand messaging, like taglines and, you know, all the different things. And I know people can get kind of overwhelmed. Like, where should people start when they're trying to maybe map this out for themselves in a really cohesive way?
Ooh, that's a great question, because you generally don't start by hiring somebody, because you're like, oh, I could do this, right? So but it is really hard to see yourself. So I would say, number one, like, what are the features of yourself? Like, what are the little funny, quirky, weird, odd, darling, annoying, whatever they are, what are the little aspects of you? And this requires you to be self-aware. So if you're a person, like, I love any kind of assessment, like, oh, I took the Enneagram, I did human design, I've done, you know, Myers-Briggs, I've done everything. So I know myself really well. And so I would say, like, what are the little aspects of you? Are you a perfectionist? Do you like things to be tidy? Are you kind of introverted? Like, what are the aspects that make you you? These are probably the things, if you live with a teenager, that they make fun of. But or that, like, you know, your sister and your brother like tease you about. Those are the cool, fun, weird things that make you you. So honestly, sit down and start like saying like, oh yeah, well, so I'm an Enneagram 1. My whole orientation to the world is like, I can't make a mistake. I can't do anything wrong. I have to fix everything. And it makes me annoying to some people, but it makes me awesome to other people. And so I would say, like, what are the things that make you a little annoying to some people and a little awesome to other people, or that serve you? And just kind of like adopt them as basically like loving little stuffed animals. Like, oh, this is like the cute little funny, quirky, weird part of myself. Those are really basic things that you start leaning into that make you different from somebody else doing the exact same freaking thing in your field, right? And there are going to be people out there who want to work with you because you are that way, versus somebody else who might be hiding that part of themselves. So that might feel a little bit too like exposed, but like, there's just, you know, there's parts of you that you're just like, no, this is just who I am. Like, I'm going to give you a silly example, but personally, I hate camping. I don't ever want to go camping. I'm totally indoorsy. I'm a little bit lazy. I'm more outsidey than outdoorsy. So like, that's just like, I like to kind of tease and make fun of myself because I would really rather like sit on the porch than actually go for a hike. So please don't invite me for a hike. Like that kind of thing just lets people know a part of my personality that seems completely irrelevant, but it might be something out there that somebody else is like laughing at me about right now, or is like, oh my God, me too. Or how could she not like camping? It's just a way to let people in so that like we can start to learn to trust each other and like see what we have in common and see how we can connect. So I think that's a really silly example, but it actually kind of works if you'll just sit down and do that.
No, I love it. I agree. I am a outdoorsy in that I like to drink wine on a patio, kind of.
Yes,
so I hear
exactly. You. Outsidey. I like to call that outsidey.
I like it. I like it. Yeah. So it bonds people, right? And if anyone's listening to this, they're probably like, oh, me too, Jen, right? Yes. So it seems silly, but it's not silly. And I love that that's like an easy way. So like take a notebook out, do your 3 categories that we were talking about, and then write down like all those silly things that are you. Maybe put them as like a Post-it or on your whiteboard or somewhere that you can look at all times, so that anytime you're creating a piece of social media content, or maybe you're doing a video, or maybe you're writing a blog post or whatever it may be, you can remind yourself of like, okay, how can I intertwine my personality aspects into this piece of content? Can it be in the caption? Can it be in like the intro hook of your video? Can it be
a story about that thing?
Exactly, a story. So like everything that we've learned today in this interview, like how can we wrap it up with a little bow, is that's the way to do it. Create your sticky note or your little brief from what we've talked about, and then go off and create a piece of content with it.
Yes. And have fun with it. Have a little more fun with it. It's not like this drudgery.
Exactly. And if you feel so inclined, you can always tag me or Jen. I'm sure maybe you don't want a million notifications, but tag us so we can see and we can have fun, and we can maybe bond with you on some sort of silly thing that is part of your personality.
I love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show with me today. I know you have a freebie for my audience, so you want to tell us a little bit about that before we wrap up?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on this like simple, silly conversation that I had with you today. I hope people found it useful. So what the thing that I found is that people who don't like to be in the spotlight tend to kind of default to how-to content in the name of value, because they're experts, they know stuff. Let me give you some how-tos. But it doesn't connect your audience with you. And so I figured out a way to create 21 content prompts that you can like tweak and repeat over and over again that are not focused on you, the creator. They're actually focused on the audience. So they're always like, there's ways for you to enter into writing some content that like takes the onus off of you, where you get to showcase your expertise, but it's not you giving away how-to content. So it's called the Backstage Brilliance Marketing Toolkit. And they can grab it by going to jenliddy.com. I'm a one-N Jen. jenliddy.com/backstage. And put your first name in there, Melissa, and they get it for free. It's basically an awesome workbook with 21 prompts, but I also included videos, audios, like a private podcast, and transcripts for people who prefer to like read or watch or listen. And I basically teach you how to kind of take the spotlight off yourself, but be able to show up with value so that it connects with your audience in a way that feels like you, without you feeling like jazz handsy about your business.
I love it. That is such an amazing gift. So thank you for giving that. And I'll make sure to put all the links and everything below this video or below the podcast of the show notes. So amazing. Thank you so much again.
This was so much fun.
All right. Bye.